pleased to have with us today Heath Mello, a native of Omaha, Nebraska. Senator Mello got his degree from UNL in 2002, I think I heard you say, in political science. For 8 years, he served as a Nebraska State Senator, spent 4 years as chairman of the Appropriations Committee, and served on the Nebraska Retirement Systems Committee, along with many other committees. He began his role as Vice President for External Relations at Nebraska University in July of 2020, after serving as interim director in that role. He brings 18 years of public policy communications, marketing, fundraising, and community relations in the nonprofit and higher education sector. Today he's going to talk to us about what's been going on in the legislature. And there isn't anybody who probably knows more about that than Heath Mello. Heath?
So before I get started, I want to give a couple stories, or at least some, to give maybe a preview a little bit of what we'll talk about. One, I got to say hello to, as a student worker in the Office of Admissions, Larry Ruth was the admissions director. And it was nice to see someone that I worked for as a student. The other person I know, Dr. Greason, I don't see was here, but Dr. Greason was the vice chancellor when I was an undergraduate student, involved in a lot of campus activities. And perhaps the one fear I've got is Dr. Forsythe is in the back there, and he gave me my only C at my time at university in American Foreign Policy, which I then bridged more to the American government side in comparison to domestic or international activities. It was a great class, and he was one of my favorite instructors to learn from. I'd be remiss not to acknowledge one of your new retiree members, Michelle Waite, who was an assistant to Chancellors Perlman, Green, and I believe Meeser, who was my first chancellor when I was a student. And Michelle retired this past fall, was a colleague of mine for the last 5 years. Before that, a colleague of former Senator Ron Witham for 20 years. She was clearly the eyes and ears here on campus for not just the university writ large at UNL, but for the other campuses as well. She was one of the deans of our community and government relations teams across the university, and you're lucky to have her. I miss her. But I will tell you, she is not missing anything in regards to what I'm going to share with you today about what's happening at your state government. So, real quick, let's try it again. Okay. So I won't spend too much time on this overall slide about our unique form of government here in Nebraska, but the Nebraska unicameral truly is a very unique governing structure compared to anywhere else in the United States. And the unique aspect of it clearly is the nonpartisan nature. There's not Democrats, Republicans when you're elected. There's no formal caucus structures inside the unicameral, which means every state senator, all 49 of them, get to act as independent actors on stage. They get to walk to the beat of their own drum. They get to introduce whatever they want to introduce. They get to operate however they choose they want to operate, which is very unique from the other 49 states, as well as what we see in the United States House of Representatives and the U.S. Senate. So that being the general backdrop, we as a state have generally seen our unicameral and our state government be considerably more effective and efficient in light of that structure. We're able to get things done quicker than a lot of other states purely because of our model and how the culture was established for us to be able to pass laws, to review laws, to make changes, and to work with a nonpartisan unicameral and an executive branch in the governor's office. And so that being the backdrop, that is generally how I was taught how state government works when I went and toured the state capitol as a fourth grader, and what I learned when I went through my new state senator orientation back in 2008. And I would say to some extent, prior to the last few years, that still kind of was the general model, the general frame that everybody operated. But as we will share a little bit today, that may not be the case in light of some significant changes we've seen in state government. So before we get started too much, just the basics of how, I don't want to go through all of these items. I'll let you read some of them. But being a nonpartisan unicameral, our process is also very unique in the sense that George Norris, when he helped create the unicameral, senators that followed George Norris as they implemented how the legislature was to operate, created some processes in place to ensure, one, there was considerable transparency for the public, and two, to make sure there were some safeguards put in place in light of a body of 49 people who were entirely in control of the state. And I say that because our unicameral is the single most powerful governing legislative body in the United States. There is more power vested with our unicameral than the United States Senate, than Congress, than any other legislature because of its size and partially because of its process. You can see here such things as every single legislative bill that gets introduced has a public hearing. So we as taxpayers, we as residents of Nebraska get to go weigh in on any single piece of legislation where that's not the case. I've traveled a lot of other state capitals and met with a lot of other legislators when I was in office. And that's truly something that most people are still shocked about when they're not from Nebraska, that typically they may have a hearing in the middle of the night, no one goes to it, and the bill's passed the next day, and that's how their processes work. So we have a considerable amount of transparency. Civic engagement is a significant component of our unicameral with that public engagement, both for public hearings. They've advanced technology-wise, now incorporate vehicles and platforms for you to weigh in on policies any time of the day. You don't have to go to the Capitol now and go sit in a chair and testify. You now can use a new online platform they've adopted that you can share your views on any single piece of legislation at any point during the legislative session, and it will get shared with all 49 senators, not just the person who introduced the bill, not just the committee the bill's being heard, but all 49 senators can get a communication from you about your views on that proposal, why you like it, why you don't, or why you think the state needs to do something different. The other aspect that's kind of unique with us is that we have 3 rounds of debate. A lot of states, you pass a bill, it passes the House, it then goes to the Senate passes it, goes to the governor. And sometimes they'll pass the bill, both bills will pass simultaneously. They then have the conference committee to iron it out, that then gets sent to the governor. We have 3 rounds of debate that make sure that the public can watch everything that's happening in each round of those debates. Unfortunately, this year, we're not getting to one of the rounds of debates very often, which I'll get to. But I just share that in the sense that, there's a lot of mistrust, unfortunately, in a lot of public institutions right now. And that's been growing for a number of years. I still find a lot of pride as a Nebraskan that our form of government through our legislative branch has these mechanisms in place for us to build trust with the public, that they can follow along, that they can engage multiple steps along the way to try to change the trajectory of a public policy if they so choose. And I think that's something we can all be proud of. I think we just are reminded we should all be taking advantage of that a little bit more often though. So here's kind of the scorecard. If you're a baseball fan, this would be the scoreboard at Wrigley Field. If we're at Memorial Stadium, we're trying to see the score of the football game. This is what's on that board. Today's day 64, so they have 26 days remaining in the long 90-day legislative session. You can see by a couple of the other data points there, they have a lot of bills that have been voted out of committees that sit on the first round of debate, general file. You can see they don't have near as many bills on the second round of debate, select file, even fewer on the last third round, final reading. Now granted, I did this yesterday and I did not make the changes today. Last night at about 7:55, the legislature passed their first bill for final reading on to the governor. And of course, in no doubt legislative fashion, it was about alcohol and liquor. And that will be the first bill that Governor Jim Pillen will have the opportunity to sign or veto. And it was a kind of an omnibus liquor alcohol kind of regulations bill. I can tell you this is truly an unprecedented time in the Union Campbell's history where on day 64, they have one piece of legislation that they have passed through the process and sent to the governor. And that is truly concerning for a lot of reasons, and I'll get to those. But this is very unique. And I think a lot of us who are both fans and admirers of our form of government, those of us who still have a special place in our hearts to make sure that that place operates and runs as the unique institution it is, this scoreboard here is concerning because it truly means that Nebraskans are not getting what I would say some of the big issues that need to be addressed are not being addressed at this point in time of the legislative session. And it creates an environment that I would say is not good for some of the main attributes that George Norris created about transparency, being deliberate in regards to what's happening with policies. Those things aren't happening at that same level as we've seen in past years. So real quick, the makeup of the legislature. Part of the reason maybe the legislature is not seeing as much activity happen this year is partially due to the new legislative landscape that we're all operating under. Term limits was passed in 2000, took effect really in that 2004 timeframe was the first elections of senators who had to leave the legislature and new senators were brought in. We're now, I think, on the fourth reiteration of term limits in regards to the new classes of senators. And you can see we have out of the 49-22 first-term senators, so almost half of the legislature is doing this for the first time. They don't know the process, they don't know the culture, they don't know how that interaction works day in, day out, let alone trying to figure out what they want to do public policy-wise. We've got 13 term-limited senators, so senators who are in their final 2 years of their terms of service. That generally creates a unique dynamic for those term-limited senators to want to make a lot of deals to try to make things happen because it's their last bite at the apple, so to speak. So they may be taking votes on issues they typically don't take votes on if they can find ways to get issues they care about advanced because they only got a short amount of time left. We've got 3 appointed senators, which is unique. That's something we've seen a lot more appointments in light of senators who left for other offices. Most recently here in Lincoln, former Senator Suzanne Geis resigned last week and left her final year and 30 days or so as she is running for another office and felt best that she spent her time on that commitment. And so Governor Pillen appointed newly appointed Senator Carolyn Boson, who represents kind of East Lancaster County. She actually is an adjunct faculty member in our College of Law, or at least she was until the day she got sworn in, and then she had to resign her adjunct faculty position at this point. But there just creates, once again, new people learning the process, and that really, at the end of the day, slows down kind of the way the legislature works when you're trying to help educate and bring people along in this very, very tough process. And then probably the last couple items with the new speaker, Speaker John Arch from the Papillion area, and 10 new committee chairs. Anytime you get a new speaker, there's always a learning curve because the Speaker Arch was a chair of a committee, the Health and Human Services Committee. Being a committee chair and becoming speaker are completely two different things. The Speaker of the legislature has, I believe, the most difficult job in state government of trying to herd 48 other senators and trying to build an agenda for them to debate issues and trying to be the equivalent of a high school principal at times, trying to mitigate, trying to negotiate, and trying to get relationships repaired or build new relationships, which is not easy in this very tumultuous political environment that we all live in. I like this slide because I just want to share in the sense of, from a university perspective. It's not only because I served in this committee for 8 years and I have a lot of great fond memories of my time on the Appropriations Committee, but as a university, we are a state agency, and our single biggest, most important aspect that we deal with every single year with state government is our funding. Is the state of Nebraska provides 62% of our state aided budget comes from the state of Nebraska, and about 31% comes from tuition, or 62% comes from the state, give or take 37% comes from tuition, and about 1% comes from other investment incomes. So we're a very unique university in a very unique state where we get almost 2/3 of our money comes from the state of Nebraska and taxpayers in comparison to tuition. And Michelle knows this from her time working with other Big Ten universities. We are an anomaly from all our other Big Ten peers in the sense of seeing how much support we get from the state in comparison. Most states have that reverse. They get about 35% of their funding from the state and 60% comes from tuition. That's why these 9 people's names on these screens are so important. These 9 members are who we think about every single day in, day out, because they have more control over the future of the university than anybody. Because they ultimately get to decide our budget request every 2 years. And the one caveat I'd share, you can see on the screen, we have 3 new committee members. Senator Christy Armendariz from Omaha, Senator Rob Dover from Norfolk, and Senator Lauren Lippincott from Central City. So 3 new members who are going through a very long, arduous budget process for the first time. We also have a new committee chair in Senator Rob Clements. Senator Clements, I believe, is a 1972 alum, or 1973 alum of UNL in mathematics. Senator Clements has been on the committee for 6 years. As the new chair, I will simply share that we have as a university, even though he is an alum, we have a considerable amount of work to do in regards to winning the heart and mind of Senator Clements as chair of that committee. The university has been very, very fortunate for, I would say, the last 30 plus years of having a very strong, close relationship with the Appropriations Committee chair, dating back to the 1990s with the famous Jerome Warner, moving on to Scott Moore, who was a UNL alum, Roger Wehrbein from Plattsmouth, who was a UNL alum, Don Peterson out in North Platte, who was an alum, whose son was our athletic director. Levon Heidemann, while not an alum, was a big supporter of UNL particularly. Myself for 4 years, and our most recent chair, John Stinner, a 2-time alum of UNL as well. So we've had a very long history of having a UNL alum being the chair of this very powerful committee, and then always had a very special relationship. And it pains me to say that we just, in light of the different climate we're in, different priorities of the legislature, we at this point don't have that same relationship with Chairman Clements. It's work that clearly President Carter, the chancellors, myself, and others are working on, but it creates a unique dynamic for the university of how we maneuver and move in this very unique political climate. I'm going to be very quick on some of these priorities because some of them have already happened. They've already moved through the process. There's some really good news, and there's some news that we just are waiting to hear still a little bit more on. So the single biggest issue, the university, I know when I spoke, I popped in the February meeting, said hello, dropped off some materials for you in regards to our budget request hearing, I Love NU Day, things of that nature. Thank you if you contacted the Appropriations Committee to share your story, because from when we had our public hearing back on Friday, March 3rd, we were able to see some progress with Governor Pillen and a majority of the members of the committee to increase the initial funding that was proposed for the university from 2% to 2.5%. That 0.5% number is real money for us at the end. It's about $9.75 million, which is the equivalent of a 1% tuition increase system-wide. So that was a real positive movement with President Carter speaking with Governor Pillen, worked out an agreement in terms of where the governor could increase his comfort level, providing us more funding, and we were able to find one additional vote on the committee. Senator Rob Dover from Norfolk was the deciding vote to help make that happen for us. Not the chairman of the committee, which is concerning, but nonetheless, we were very, very happy with their decisions as they made it early last week. That essentially means the budget for us as a university is complete. The Appropriations Committee will work their way through this week and hopefully vote on their final budget recommendation at the end of this week and submit it to the legislature early next week. Another item that was included in their budget, LB 273 at the bottom of your screen, the state has one need-based financial aid program known as the Nebraska Opportunity Grant Program. And we're one of the lowest funded need-based scholarship programs in the entire country. Senator Tony Vargas from South Omaha introduced a bill to significantly increase that scholarship funding by $7.5 million. Unfortunately, the committee didn't see that as a big enough priority. They did increase it by $500,000. So we do generally take that as a positive progress towards providing more need-based financial aid to students who we know need it. The university sees about half of that funding in light of the size of our need-based Pell-eligible student population across the whole university system. So our students will see about $250,000 out of that $500,000 increase that was proposed. One bill on here that I've been really trying to talk a lot more about with anyone who will listen is LB 201. LB 201 was another bill introduced by Senator Tony Vargas that was based on a proposal he did a few years ago, which would require every high school graduate in the state, for them to be able to graduate from high school, they would have to file and fill out the FAFSA form, the Federal Financial Aid Form. That may sound concerning in the sense that we're going to hold back people from graduating from high school for them to fill out this form. But Senator Vargas, in regards to kind of working this through with a variety of different stakeholders, created multiple mechanisms where superintendents, high school principals, guidance counselors can automatically waive students not to have to fill this out if their family doesn't want to do it, or the student doesn't want to do it at the end of the day. So it's not really, as I've told people, a mandate as we would typically call it. It is a very strong nudge to families and students to fill out the FAFSA. And if they choose to not want to fill out, they simply got to go through a process and let people know at the school that they don't want to do it. They'll continue their ability to graduate from high school. The reason this is a big priority, and I don't know what Chancellor Green may have shared with you when he chatted with you last, but we have some considerable enrollment challenges at the university right now, particularly at the UNL campus. Also, we see this at the UNK campus out in Harding. And so any opportunity we as those in the policy-making space can say, if we can encourage students who may typically not thought about going into a higher education pathway to fill out a FAFSA form, find out they qualify for full Pell, that helps open the door for them to be able to pursue an opportunity that could change their life. We felt this was that big of a priority for the university, that this has been one of our key issues this year that does not involve funding, does not involve money. It's simply encouraging more Nebraskans to consider higher education, whether it's at the university, the state college system, community college system, or private colleges. We're not trying to pick anyone out and say they only got to come to us, but it's encouraging those first generation students and their families to really try to take that step further along the way, working with their guidance counselors, working with their K-12 partners to try to make that a reality. I'll kind of breeze through these items here. A couple of them are items that will possibly see some action sometime this year, but maybe held over to next year. We've worked on police legislation regarding the university for decades, it feels like. We may see some progress with a compromise that's coming out. Doesn't do exactly what the university wants, but it does recognize the university's police officers for death benefits, tuition benefits, and it will allow our campus police departments to enter into interlocal agreements with various law enforcement agencies outside the county that we reside in. And for UNL, that is crucial, knowing how much space or how much property UNL has across the state. So the UNLPD wants to enter into a Saunders County interlocal agreement because of the NREC facility. We'll be able to do that in light of LB 382. LB 407 is a bill involving the University of Nebraska Medical Centers Project Next. They were awarded $300 million back in 2020. If they were able to obtain $1 billion of federal funding and $300 million in private philanthropic funding for kind of a next generation medical center campus at UNMC, LB 407 extends that application deadline for them to qualify for that state funding. Last but not least, LB 705 is a lottery reauthorization bill. There's some good news and bad news. We have to reauthorize the lottery funding so that most of that money comes to the Nebraska Opportunity Grant Program every year. Unfortunately, That program is just not a key priority of this year's education committee like in the years past. And the education committee has decided to reduce the allocation to the Nebraska Opportunity Grant Program. And they put the money in worthwhile effort to provide more funding to K-12 school districts for behavioral health for students. But we're going to see about $1 million reduction a year from lottery funding going to those need-based financial aid grants. So while Senator Vargas got us $500,000 increase, it really was about a $500,000 decrease when you take into consideration what happens with the reauthorization of the state lottery funding. So here is perhaps the main slide of today's conversation as the legislative issue landscape for the remaining 26 days. So I think some of you have probably no doubt followed some of the big, bold proposals Governor Jim Pillen has released earlier back in January involving tax reform, involving our property tax system, our income tax system, as well as the future of the state's public education funding in terms of how that state funding is allocated. That is still perhaps the one area of policy that I think we will see the legislature take action on and get something passed in the remaining 26 days. In a nutshell, it's changing the way the state provides public schools funding in terms of giving it per pupil, so that there's foundation funding for every pupil in the state will get $1,500 for their school district, which is a considerable change of how the state used to or currently is doing, how they allocate state funding for public education. You'll also see some pretty big changes when it comes to property taxes. They're essentially taking most of the community colleges across the state off of the property tax rolls and are going to fund that with state funding. That is a unique impact to the university because typically in the budget process, the University of Nebraska, the state college system, and the community college system are all considered to be discretionary spending. There's not a formula that drives how much money we get like public education in the K-12 sector or Medicaid. This now takes the community colleges off your property tax roll. So if you live in Lincoln and you're paying property tax at Southeast Community College, you will see your property tax bill be reduced dramatically. They will end up keeping, I believe, 2 cents of their existing 11-cent property tax levy that is currently being levied here in Southeast Community College, and they can only use that 2 cents for their capital construction and the bonds that they've done. That other 9 cents is going to be covered by the state, and moving forward, the state has committed under these proposals that they will appropriate 3.5% every single year to the community colleges across the state, which as we're fighting for 2 to 2.5%, theirs is put into statute, so theirs is automatic. We still have to go in front of the governor and the appropriations committee and argue the best we can for any increase year after year. So once again, I never say anything bad about our higher ed partners. They are truly stakeholders. We work with them on a lot of issues. But as you think about the future of the university when it comes to long-term funding and some of the budget challenges the university has, add that to the mix of something that we clearly are going to have to figure out of being now one of the last 2 items left that are purely at the discretion of the governor and the legislature, and we're not built in any kind of funding formula. Another big issue the legislature has wrestled with since probably 2014, 2013, almost 10 years now, is what to do in terms of the state's correctional system and the criminal justice system. That was something I worked on my second term in the legislature, and it has continued to happen year in, year out. Unfortunately, I think we will probably not see a lot of action this year on major criminal justice reform as it involves sentencing reforms, what to do in terms of some major reentry services and programming, housing for those who are returning citizens back to our communities. The biggest thing we'll probably hear about is the construction of a new $325 million prison. That will be the focus of this year's legislature when it comes to the criminal justice discussions. It's a holdover from Governor Ricketts' administration. Governor Pillen actually increased that appropriation another $100 million to try to get that prison built. Part of the reason, as the argument was, inflation has increased the cost of building a new prison, and so they had to increase that adequately to be able to build the size and scope of prison they need to address the significant and severe overcrowding crisis facing our current system. The biennial budget, I'm going to hold off on that a little bit till the next slide, but that is clearly the only thing the legislature has to do. They don't have to do anything else the rest of the 26 days besides pass the constitutionally mandated balanced budget. So that is the only thing I can promise you will pass, is that, because they have to do it. But we'll find out more as they finalize and release that budget next week. The bottom two buckets here is perhaps what's captured both consternation and admiration from Nebraskans from Omaha to Scotts Bluff in light of what they're seeing out of their legislature. There has been considerable focus on a handful of social policy proposals this legislative session that I would say are issues that are not new to the Nebraska legislature. Issues involving abortion care, reproductive health care is brought typically every year in some form or another, as well as issues involving discrimination in some form or another. In this case, this year's gender affirming care proposal is a little bit more unique, I should say, than what we've seen in the past. But nonetheless, we've also seen proposals on Second Amendment rights, gun regulations get brought every single year. So these are issues that the legislature does address in some capacity or gets brought to them every single year. And the legislature typically finds ways to move ahead and move forward, whether they pass the bills or they don't, they find a way to get other business done. For whatever reason this year, there has been an approach taken, which is to, regardless of the outcome of some more controversial proposals, the approach has been taken to limit the entire activity of the legislature because of those proposals, which for those of you who have worked with or have followed former Senator Ernie Chambers, was the master of the legislative rules. He could take over a floor debate, take over the legislature on a moment's notice. I served with Senator Chambers for 4 years, and never once in my 4 years did he do what we're seeing now. He would filibuster bills. He'd spend an entire day filibustering bills. But couple things. He would always try to make the bills better if he could. If they were bad bills that he didn't like, he would try to find a way to make it the best public policy it could because he knew it was going to pass. And he knew he didn't have the votes to stop it. So he wanted to try to make it better at the end of the day. Or he wanted to try to change it so he could get challenged in court. One of those two options. But nonetheless, Senator Chambers always found every year I worked with him, when he was filibustering a bill he didn't like and was slowing down the legislature, there would be moments in time he would find a way to step back and let the legislature get done the rest of the business that it needed to get done. And typically it was finding a way to get one of his priorities advanced or allow an issue that he was passionate about to bring it to the forefront. Speakers of the legislature found ways to do that with the master of the rules, the person who knew the legislature better than anybody else. And for whatever reason this year, that approach is not being taken, both with a group of senators who are filibustering every single bill, which is their right to do, and the current leadership of the legislature is not finding a way for them to come to some agreement. And it's not for me to judge at the end of the day. I'm just relaying information and from personal experiences. It's not me to judge in regards to what policies and proposals they should take action on, the speaker should put on the agenda, the speaker should hold, whether or not senators should give up their right to filibuster very, very important legislation that they are very passionate about. I would never suggest that or say that. The struggle I think a lot of us who follow the legislature, work in the legislature, or have interactions with the legislature are frustrated with is that typically we find ways to come to an agreement in some form or another. You may have to compromise in some capacity to get something passed or to dial back what you want a little bit for the greater good at times, and we're not seeing that. We're seeing both sides really dig their heels in on these issues, and they've come to an impasse that there is truly no way forward with the exception of moving the bill if you have the votes to pass those bills. And the only recourse that the senators in the minority are saying they have is that they've got to filibuster everything to try to make the process hurt for the other senators so that they'll change their mind or they'll relent and say, we don't want to vote on this bill or we don't want to do that. It's a strategy, it's an approach. We haven't seen that done before. All I can share with you is that I've had more people express their frustration with the legislature this year than my entire life combined. Even when I took really bad votes on things that people were very upset with, I've never had this kind of visceral reaction from the public of there's got to be a way to stop this. And there are ways to stop it, but once again, that rests with the senators. It's not rests with lobbyists like myself. It doesn't rest with other folks. It's the senators got to find a way to spend some time to come to a compromise. And part of that reason, Caroline, I mentioned this earlier before we started, part of it that has really exacerbated this year is the severe lack of civility within the legislature, how people treat each other. It's unlike anything, and I attribute partially some of it to social media. That has taken on an entirely different tact of how people operate in politics and how they operate in government. But the way people are treating each other right now, it would make it very hard for me to see anybody wanting to sit down opposing sides and iron out some kind of alternative, because they truly are belittling each other by name on the floor of the legislature in a public space. I tell them that lives on forever. That's on the record for eternity. And people are saying things that I would have never thought to say when I was a former senator. Like I said, I couldn't fathom saying that. I'd be too nervous to say that about another person in a public setting like that. And I think that has diminished the trust within the legislature. And I think the speaker knows that he has a lot of work to do over the interim to find ways for people who may not always agree to have at least trust with each other, find ways to rebuild the civility that used to exist in the legislature for the most part. Because otherwise, this is going to be the new normal, I'm afraid, for our Nebraska Union Campbell. That we won't see a lot of activity get done. We'll see everything get filibustered, and it will feel like what you hear about in Washington, D.C., where it's an us versus them mentality, and we as Nebraskans lose out. And I think that's the biggest fear. Not just the university, but we as Nebraskans lose out in regards to that good form of government that we've been used to utilizing, participating in for generations. So what's next? So the legislature has a term called late nights, and late nights are truly the worst experience every single year at the Nebraska legislature. It's when the speaker says, we're going to start our day at 9 a.m. and we're going to end our day sometime before midnight. And you have to plan your day accordingly of you're there at least 9 a.m. to 9 p.m. and you just get tired. You get worn down. You're following this, you're talking, you're trying to get work done in between filibusters and bills. Typically, the speaker doesn't typically call late nights until May. 1st of May typically is when it starts. And it's the last, give or take, 25 days maximum is typically when it is. We started late nights the last week of March. So these black bags underneath my eyes are not from just last night. It's literally night after night of having to follow what the legislature is doing till this speaker's been good. He's not gone past 9 o'clock most nights. He's gone only past 9 o'clock a couple times. So it's usually they get done by 9 o'clock. Sometimes they'll get done by 8 o'clock, depending on what the agenda looks like. But the legislature physically, senators, their staff, lobbyists, people who are involved in this process are just completely worn down. It's people who don't have the energy, they're upset, they're agitated, and people aren't getting the sleep they need to be able to get the work done. And that's going to make the last few weeks of the legislature very, very interesting as they try to get done some of those big items I mentioned earlier passed before day 90. One small correction there, the May 2nd actually is day 70. And as I mentioned earlier, the Appropriations Committee's wrapping up the biennial budget process now. They will vote on their final budget package, hopefully later this week, submit it to the legislature. I would expect they'll start debating that per the legislature's rules, if not on day 70, May 2nd, maybe the day after on May 3rd, because they've got to get the budget passed by day 80. You can see that May 18th. So that is kind of the calendars you think about what's happening, what you'll be reading about, seeing on the newspaper or on television. You'll hear it, and most of May will be about the state budget. That will be the focus of what everyone will be talking about, particularly with the state having such an influx of funding and money available for tax changes, for spending items, for a variety of things. So there'll be a lot of focus in the middle of May on all things fiscal related. My estimation is the last 24 days, as we're doing today, they've got a couple final reading bills tonight. We'll see what happens. I don't believe they're going to pass more than 30 bills by the end of the legislature, which will be a record low number of bills that they pass. One thing I didn't talk a lot about, and I should have mentioned that when I had the word omnibus legislation. Out of these 30 bills, let's say, that get passed, there will probably be 6 or 7 of those bills that we're now using the term omnibus. Michelle and I would use the word Christmas trees, because that's what they were called. You have one bill and you hang an ornament here, and hang another ornament there. You can't hang too many ornaments or the tree will topple over. This year they're taking a different approach because they only have so many days left. Only so many bills are going to be able to get passed if every bill's being filibustered. That they're taking more of a congressional approach of creating omnibus legislation. Where, for example, there's an omnibus education proposal that has anywhere between 15 to 30 proposals that will get put into that, all related to education, which typically we don't see anything more than 5 or 6 on a Christmas tree bill. So what we will have is 8 hours of filibuster on an education omnibus bill. There's no way they're going to be able to debate 30 bills. So the legislature will be voting on a number of proposals that they will not arguably get to debate. And you as the second house will not hear what people are really thinking about bills that get tucked into these omnibus bills, which creates a very unique dynamic because the legislature's not done this before. They're very transparent about when they add bills in. And I think that is, so there's a selfishness. As a former senator, I'd say that's not a good approach to take. Taking a handful of bills to do, that's the model. As a lobbyist, if you've got some bill that you want to get passed and you don't want a lot of people to know about, these omnibus bills are, these are truly the last train out of Clarksville. I mean, this is it. That was a Monkees reference, I think, for some of you remember. So it's growing up, it's all good. But there's 3 or 4 of these omnibus bills I think a lot of people are keeping their eyes and ears on. The Revenue Committee, for an example, all the major tax bills, they've got an omnibus bill, about 23 bills right now. Education has got a minimum 15, they're looking to add more in. The Banking, Commerce, Insurance Committee has passed one that's on final reading today. They've done it down a little bit. I think they've only got 8 proposals in there. So it's kind of more like the old version of a Christmas tree conversation. And the Urban Affairs Committee appears to have an omnibus bill where they have a lot of appropriation items that are being looked to appropriate for North and South Omaha, community and economic development. Lincoln, City of Lincoln getting $200 million for new water source. And some other rural economic development projects dumping in a number of proposals, anywhere between 12 and 13 proposals that are all maybe good proposals, but they're just not going to be able to give them the time and focus when it comes to debating them of whether or not we want, the legislature wants to support them or not support them. And when they're all packaged like that, you may not support one proposal, but you support the other 12. It's putting senators in a very tough spot. Term is generally called log rolling, is what it was called prior to. That senators are going to have to vote for some of these bills because there's so many bills in there they got to support, even if they don't like 1 or 2 of them. I will give Speaker Arch a lot of credit, though. While this is a unique mechanism the legislature is utilizing this year, he has set some parameters that, at least in his view, proposals have to be voted on out of the committee, mostly unanimous. So at least you're getting the information from committee members and committees that these bills are all voted out, no opposition. It makes it a little bit easier for the legislature to stomach, the public to stomach, that these are bills that don't have a lot of controversy at the end of the day. We're going to wait and see ultimately what gets included in all of them, because I have a feeling there will be a couple of them that do have a little bit of controversy, and I just a question of whether or not they submarine the whole omnibus bill or the legislature goes along and supports them at the end of the day. So, I want to wrap up a couple slides here. One, I want to thank you again for those of you at the February meeting who, when I shared some information about our appropriations here and asked you to reach out to your state senator, reach out to the Appropriations Committee in support of our appropriations budget request. Thank you. The work of a university advocate never stops, because we have stories across not just UNL, but the other campuses as well, that we can be telling our policymakers, their staff, day in, day out, about the impact that we're making in people's lives, their families' lives, their business, their farm, you name it. And so some of this data that I share with you is data that we always like to remind people about. It's system-wide data, impacts the entire University of Nebraska system. But when you think about it, we have one of the largest economic impacts in the state of Nebraska as a university, with $5.8 billion every year. That's helping drive the state's economy. 1 out of every 27 jobs are connected to the university across the state. Perhaps for us right now, with what our economy is dealing with in Nebraska, the biggest factor is 11,000 graduates every single year. And with 80,000 vacant jobs right now currently across Nebraska, the fact that we're still the single largest producer of talent day in, day out shows the relevant impact at this moment in time. But Chancellor Green would attest, President Carter would attest, our other chancellors, we've got to produce more. The state, the workforce, the business community, employers are looking to us to produce more, to get more graduates out quicker, faster, and into the workforce. So this is really great data that we highlight, but please know it's still work that we've got to continue to do as a state moving forward. I will kind of slide through this a little bit here. I gave you some feedback and information on this back in February. If you haven't signed up to be one of our advocates, please do so. You can get on our website, sign up. We try to give you legislative updates during the legislative session on what's happening about the university priorities, things that are happening in the legislature, as well as work we do during the interim. So please sign up if you haven't. And it really helps us share some of the unique data that we're able to compile from across the university to help you tell your own story about the university, but also other stories that you've gathered from your work here at UNL. That being said, thank you again for the opportunity to spend some time with you. I know, as a retiree or an emeriti faculty member or staff, you could be out golfing, you could be out sailing, traveling, doing a lot of other things instead of coming to this lunch right now. And I simply want to thank you for taking time of what you do to give back to this campus, what you do to give back to our students at this campus, and to continue to ask you to consider giving back more to your state. While your public service here at the university, no doubt, has left an impact in countless lives, we have the next generation of people still coming through this university, and those that we're recruiting right now, that we're trying to give them the same experiences that you gave past students, past faculty, past staff. And the work in front of us in the legislature this year and years ahead will be more challenging. It's going to only get more difficult. There will be budget challenges across the university which will make us look different than we currently look right now. But the one thing that I'm very optimistic about is that the university has impacted so many people's lives that if we can simply encourage those folks who are the closest to the university to share their story with policymakers, the governor, senators, staffs along the way, that they will see they can't turn a blind eye to us at the end of the day. They can't turn their backs on their only university system in some entity that is producing that much positive impact day in, day out. So that being said, I want to thank you for being here today, but more importantly, thank you for what hopefully you'll continue to do moving forward of advancing not just the University of Nebraska-Lincoln, but your entire university system. Thanks a lot. Questions, there we go, questions, all right.
How does the speaker Arch move, how does he get bills to move forward for viable?
So the question was, how does the speaker essentially get to determine bills, legislative priorities, legislative bills that move forward? That is the unique power of the Nebraska unicameral speaker, is that person has complete control, give or take, over the legislative agenda day in, day out. The speaker gets to decide whatever the legislature gets to debate every single day. And that is very unique, where you want to become friends with the speaker, because if you want your bill to come up, the speaker is the one who decides it. There's no order the speaker has to choose either. People think, well, if my bill got voted out ahead of John's, my bill's gotta come, nope, speaker's like, I'm not gonna schedule John's bill because I don't wanna schedule it. And that is the unique power structure in the unicameral, which is why the speaker has such, I would say, unbelievable power, but also the speaker also has clearly a considerable amount of challenges day in, day out with 48 other people coming to that individual, asking to schedule their bill and prioritize me over the other folks.
How do you think Governor Pillen is going to accommodate, or whatever you want to call it, the omnibus bills and his veto power? What do you think about that?
That is a great question about the omnibus bills, about whether Governor Pillen, who I think as a UNL alum and UNL retirees and emeriti, I think we can be proud that we have one of our own as governor, first time in a long time since former Governor Ben Nelson was the last university alum who was governor. Governor Pillen in his operation has been very candid that they're looking and monitoring all of the proposals getting put into the omnibus bills. For example, it was, I think, covered in the news media today. I read about it last night. A bill involving superintendent pay, limiting what superintendents can get paid. That is not being included in the education omnibus bill because Governor Pillen has indicated he would veto that. And if it does get included in the omnibus bill, it sounds like he'll veto the omnibus bill. So the committee chair and committee members are wrestling of whether or not they really want to roll the dice, so to speak, and challenge the governor on that. I don't think they will at the end of the day. I think they'll have that be brought up for a separate discussion or separate debate, maybe even next year. But Governor Pillen's team has been very candid about they want to be able to support these omnibus bills, but if there are proposals that, as they mentioned yesterday in today's news reports, they have no problem filibustering or vetoing something if they don't support it, even if there's 12 to 13 other items they do support.
Given the divisiveness that we've seen, do you believe there's the will at all, and do they have the skills to perhaps work together? And is it likely to get better, worse, or about the same?
Nancy, I will tell you, I've always generally had a sunnier, optimistic side to life. And even in politics, that's why it is I went to public service at a young age, because I thought to go make a change and change the world for the better. I want to hope that this will be a teaching moment for adults who no doubt are very passionate about positions and views they have, but realize that this is the process as it works. Sometimes you win, sometimes you lose, and you go find other ways to make compromise or build consensus on items. I want to hope that they're going to get back there. And I think that the next couple weeks will find that out, truly. I think if they don't, I think it's going to, I'm really concerned about what the future holds. Because you've got generally some pretty thoughtful people in the legislature who want to find ways to get things done. Acknowledge they may not get everything they want, so they're willing to make compromises to the minority on different issues. But as I mentioned, the advent of social media has truly coarsened our discourse. You can get on Twitter and say outlandishly obnoxious, derogatory, hateful remarks about someone and never see them in person, and incite other people to say, yes, I agree, that person's the worst, or this is absolute. When I left the legislature in 2016, it was my last year or year and a half was when social media really started to take off in the legislature. Senators started to use Twitter and tweet about things, occasionally post things on Facebook, but never, nothing like you see today. Videos of people talking bad about each other right in front of them. It's become more of a blood sport than it's become more of policymaking or legislating or governing. And social media, I'm afraid, has made that worse.
Yes.
And I'm not one for censorship. I believe in everyone's First Amendment rights. And I think social media is going to be around forever. I think it's going to involve more and more of what we do in government and politics and policymaking. I think there's just, the legislature's gonna have to find a way to adapt itself culturally to that, because it's great people are communicating directly to senators and their staff through social media. They're getting real-time feedback, engagement from constituents who may otherwise would have had to place a phone call or go to the Capitol to talk to them about a policy issue. It's those who are using this as a vehicle to really just, I don't know another way to say, just do real damage to people. Just the way people treat each other is just, it's unheard of. And I just don't know. It's just people, the ability to have no repercussions has allowed people to say things that you would never normally
Right.
think people would put down in written word that would be sent out to the whole world. So, you know, I think you have some freshman senators. There's always, you know, at a university, there's always hope and light with freshmen. So they become sophomores. There's some really great freshman senators who are the most earnest, humble, I would say genuinely good human beings who signed up to do this for the right reason. I really hope we keep them in the legislature and keep them from not quitting. Because some of them have talked privately of like, they just hate this. This is not what they signed up for.
Yeah.
They felt they were gonna do some very noble work. They were called to do something bigger and better for the greater good, and they feel this is just the worst. And that's probably my fear, because these are really good, thoughtful people. I remind you, they're making $12,000 a year. They're sacrificing out with their family, their kids, you know, businesses, farms. If we lose good people, I think that's probably the tipping point, Nancy, is you start losing good people leaving the legislature because they don't want to stay there any longer because of the coarsening environment. We have major problems with our democracy and major problems with our form of government in Nebraska then. So, but I'm optimistic. Let's keep focused on these freshman members and keep them going.
What sort of impact do you think Washington DC has had on Nebraska's Unicam?
Great question, and I think a lot of the tactics that maybe we have read and seen about DC over the last decade have crept its way into our political system in Nebraska. This is just Heath being a political commentary. This is not related to the university. I want a full disclaimer. I don't know if it's being recorded or how this is people at home. Full disclaimer, it's not the university viewpoint, purely Heath Mello's. I think we have seen over the last decade Washington-style political activities, campaigns, things of that nature creep into our unique system here, where you have members of the legislature, members in state government, openly trying to get rid of people in a very public way, which is not, we never saw. Kayor didn't do that as a Republican governor in the early 80s. Ben Nelson didn't do that as a Democratic governor in the 90s. Mike Johanns, even Dave Heineman, didn't go to that length when they were governors of being more politically active. I think we saw a change in that in 2016. That started to change a little bit with the repeal of the death penalty vote the legislature made. I think we've seen that was kind of regardless of your viewpoints on that issue, the moment we saw that happen, I think we saw the legislature become more like Washington DC politically, where outside forces, outside money was going to influence what was happening politically and legislatively in Nebraska. I'm all for free speech, and I'm actually one, ironically, who was never a big fan of limiting campaign contributions. I just wanted them to report it. I think you just need more transparency at the end of the day, so that people know what they're seeing and what they're getting. I think my own personal views at some point, though, have started to drift and change a little bit where, these are $12,000 a year jobs, and you're not a U.S. congressman, congresswoman, you're not a U.S. senator. These are part-time citizen legislator positions where we're seeing an exorbitant amount of money being spent on them. And I think people at some point have to probably take a step back and really think about whether or not that's a good form, whether that's good for democracy in Nebraska. If we want to spend $700,000 on someone who's getting paid $12,000, clearly they're very powerful positions. I think people now have finally woken up that these 49 senators have tremendous amount of power and influence. And that's why I think we've seen new political tactics be implemented. I think we've seen more political grudge matches in terms of if you don't support me, I will oppose you and get other people to oppose you, which I didn't see that as much in my time in the legislature. That's just my experience. And I think that's something that we probably need to be mindful of as citizens. That political activity at Washington DC is keep creeping in more to our special camera.
Very much so.
There.
Really glad you're doing what you're doing. Don't get too discouraged and bail.
Appreciate it.
You alluded to an orientation for the freshman senators. Is there anything in that orientation in which they talk about civility and how they're going to treat each other?
Great question, and yes, Julie. I remember my orientation like it was yesterday, and there was a, I was a legislative page. It's not my bio, but I was a legislative page in 2001, the 2001 session, when I was an undergrad still here at Lincoln. And the speaker, when I was a page, was then Speaker Doug Christensen from Kearney. Lovingly now Chancellor Christensen at Kearney. He took the job the year after I was a page. Chancellor Christensen is one of the only people that the legislature would bring back every single year for the new senator orientation to talk through how relationships get built, how you manage them, how you treat people inside the legislature. And Doug was the longest serving speaker in unicameral history. Probably one of the most successful speakers in unicameral history as well. But he always, every year he comes back and we chat, me and him chat before he does it, because I'm not lobbying him. I was like, I know you're not lobbying, Doug. I get it. If you could, I'd let you, but you can't. And he always talks me through a little bit of what he wants to leave it with. And this year, after this year, he said he felt things were different. Like he liked the class, but he's starting to noticeably this is just a little different with people not buying into, people are more skeptical of the nonpartisan nature. People are more skeptical of how you do business. Why would I work with that person? They're a Democrat, I'm a Republican. Well, I want to get done what I want to get done. Why, I'm in the majority. Why do I have to work with the minority? Doug just shared that he was concerned a little bit. Add on top of that, we had a longtime clerk, Patrick O'Donnell, another UNL alum who retired in December kind of quickly. And he was the glue that kept that place together. I mean, he was there for 40 plus years. He drove that unicameral from an appointed clerk's position that I think as Nebraskans, we owe him a debt of gratitude, because he helped keep the legislature in line. Some of the civility stuff we're talking about would have never happened. He would have found ways. He has been trying to find ways to stop it. He didn't always have as much support over the last probably couple years. But you have new leadership as well in the clerk's office. Brandon Betzler is great. He's another UNL College of Law alum. But all this change, all of this churn with new senators, new career civil service staff that's come into the legislature, this massive turnover, people just don't look at civility the same way. It's just not being promoted in that same light because they're not hearing about it nationally. They're not hearing about it day in, day out. People are being rewarded politically for not being civil. Mm-hmm. You post a video saying that so and so is woke and so and so is a Neanderthal conservative. Either position people take, they post videos on like other people's opinions and views, and they're able to raise so much money from donors and supporters by giving red meat, so to speak, the term, political science term I'm looking at. I know Dr. Forsyth was international, but this was more of a state government political. Giving more red meat to their political side, it gets people more excited and they get more contributions. That's what unfortunately is happening more and more. I'm not saying that every senator does that by any stretch of the imagination. I think the challenge is outside forces see that as a viable option, And outside forces now are also influencing that civility factor a lot more. We've got groups that go to the Capitol that like film people, that are filming senators and filming constituents and lobbyists and posting stuff on social media and mocking them and saying, I mean, it's gotten to a level that I could write a chapter in my book about someday of just, this is problematic for everyone. But back to Doug Christensen, when he finally, this is the 6th year I've been doing this for the university, and this was the year he said, I think we've got some problems. First time he said, I think we've got some issues that are concerning. And with Patrick O'Donnell leaving the legislature, I think that only exacerbated the fear of the legislature losing its North Star of being civil, of being productive, of working with each other. The old adage that you may lose a vote, you all go out for a beer afterwards is what we were all taught. And that's just not really what it's like anymore, unfortunately.
As you look to the future, do you see interest in legislation that would impact other parts of higher education, such as tenure, parameters on the curriculum, freedom of speech?
Yes, the question, are there other issues involving enacting higher ed in the future? Yes, I'm afraid so. I think we initially had thought there was possibly going to be some legislation this year of trying to eliminate tenure. And we started to do some preliminary research in terms of a couple other states that this has happened. In Georgia is one that eliminated tenure more recently. And I think that we have more and more senators who are not familiar with what tenure is. They don't understand it, and they feel like once someone gets tenure, they can do whatever they want to go do, and they have no consequences writ large, which we all know that's not the case. But I think that's going to be on the horizon. Politically, President Carter just got back from a national conference, the American Council of Education. They're the kind of the super mega group for all of higher ed, takes in all of the different higher ed associations across the country. And we debriefed a little yesterday, and he said it's these issues involving clearly free speech, academic freedom, tenure, are kind of at the forefront right now of everywhere in the country, and hearing from everyone else of what their legislatures are dealing with. We're fortunate this year, good or bad, we were not a priority clearly in the budget process. The university's kind of kept a low profile this year, but there was no bills targeting the university in a negative way in that regard. And I think we were expecting, what we saw in regards to the Board of Regents activity regarding the critical race theory resolution back in August. We had a bill last year that we defeated a critical race theory, diversity, equity, inclusion ban in the 2022 session that we helped defeat. We were expecting more bills like that to come forward where we would have to stand and plant the university's flag for academic freedom and our free speech of our students, faculty, and staff. We didn't see that this year, but the challenge is real. I've got bruises on both rib cages from getting punched by senators who are clearly not happy with the university on a lot of things that are happening with faculty, staff, students even, of things that are being sent out, positions they're taking, sharing things. And I'm trying to remind senators, I was like, look, everyone's got First Amendment rights. Michelle would remind me this every single day, every time I complained about it. Everyone's got First Amendment rights, and the university cannot go tell someone that they can't exercise their First Amendment right, no matter what that person's views may be. And President Carter made that argument very succinct at our budget hearing. If any of you watched it, I always say he used his admiral voice, the Navy admiral voice, because he was pretty clear. He's like, I've worn the uniform for 38 years and defended and fought for this country and did an awful lot in the sake of freedom and protecting people's constitutional rights. And as university president, I'm going to do the same thing for our faculty, our staff, and our students who have that First Amendment right, no matter what their views may be at the end of the day. And it really kind of dialed the committee back. People kind of stood back a little bit, I think, and realized that, hey, you can't censor people in that regard. You may not agree with their viewpoint. I think it goes back, though, to the question of how do we get our university family and friends here to understand that we have to lead by example when we're talking to our public officials, regardless of our personal views on issues. And that civility component goes two ways, where we have to be able to reinforce. I may disagree with a senator as a faculty member, but I want to be able to have a very civil conversation with them and express to them why they're wrong. This is not good, and let me tell you why it's not good. And I think that's where you're probably going to hear chancellors. We chatted about this yesterday. Chancellor Green was in this conversation. We're looking for that conversation to happen more university leadership wise and with faculty senates moving forward of how we can instill that across the whole university. It's not that people can't share their viewpoint, but we have got to take it to a higher level, and we got to hold ourselves accountable that we want people, particularly our elected officials, to hear from university experts, faculty members, and staff, but hear in a very civil way of doing that. That being said, I think my time has come to an end. I want to thank you again. I appreciate it. Thank you.